Hello everybody, welcome back to another lecture for Bio 1. We are going to start with Chapter 3 this week, or we'll go over Chapter 3 this week. And the chapter information here is Chapter 3 for the Simon book. And if you have the free OpenStax book, this information is going to be Chapter 2. Section 3, I believe. So just know that those chapters are a little bit different. Okay. So when I say chapter 3, I'm mainly referring to the Simon book. But it's all the same information. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to go with an overview of the organic molecules that are important for life. And then we'll have a couple of videos that will go over each of those organic molecules in detail. All right. So organic molecules or organic compounds, right, as we mainly have learned in the chemistry lecture, the cell in the body, or the cell in all organisms for that matter, is mostly of water. And then the rest of the cell is made up of what we call carbon-based molecules. And the reason we say carbon-based molecules is because these molecules really have a foundation of carbon atoms. So their skeleton of the molecule is made up of a bunch of different carbon atoms, and the size of those molecules will depend on the type of molecule it is. And all of these carbon atoms together can really form large, complex, really diverse molecules, and they're all really important for the necessary functions of living organisms. And we refer to these carbon-based molecules as organic compounds. So the compounds that are driven structurally mainly by carbon, so they have those carbon skeletons, are known as organic compounds. And what's really cool about carbon is it's a really versatile molecule. If you remember from the chemistry lecture, we talked about carbon being able to form upwards to 4 different covalent bonds because of the properties of having only 4 electrons in its outermost electron shell. And so what that means is there's a lot of diversity that the carbon skeletons can have depending on how each of those 4 available spots for bonding are bound to other atoms. So for example, you could have single bonds, you could have double bonds, they could branch, they could be linear, they could be in a ring pattern, and we'll look at all of those types of examples in the next slide. And some of the most common atoms that organic molecules, or I'm sorry, that carbon atoms will develop covalent bonds with are atoms such as hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. Phosphorus is another one that they'll form bonds with, and so that those are typically the molecules, or I'm sorry, the atoms that you'll find in these carbon-based molecules. So here we have some examples of variations in those carbon skeletons. So up in the top left, we have, just a 2-carbon molecule with hydrogens bound around it. So a fairly small, simple molecule. On the top right, you have a carbon skeleton that has that double bond inside of it, which is denoted by those 2 lines, 2 bars to 2 lines connecting the 2 carbon atoms. And so that notation means that there's a double bond, whereas that single line means that there's only a single bond within that carbon molecule. The bottom left, we have a branching pattern, and like we mentioned in the previous slide, those carbon atoms those carbon molecules can be linear, which are the top 2 molecules, or they can branch, which is what we're seeing in that bottom left molecule. And the branching patterns can actually get really complex depending on the type of molecule that we're looking at. The final example on the bottom right is a carbon molecule in the shape of a ring. One of the more common ring molecules is glucose, sugars, Your steroids are also made up of 4 carbon rings, which we'll learn about here in a little bit. And so there are a lot of different molecules that are arranged in ring-shaped patterns, and organic molecules will sometimes be expressed as ring-shaped patterns, especially whenever they're in water. The simplest carbon or organic molecule is methane. So just one carbon atom with 4 hydrogen atoms covalently bound to that carbon molecule, so CH4. The larger organic molecules are really important for serving as fuel for our bodies. And then gasoline is also a very large organic compound that has this carbon-based structure. So if we look at some figures and the structural formula of the carbon molecules, you see on the left-hand side, we got the structural formula for CH4. So carbon with the 4 hydrogen atoms covalently bound to it. That has the single bonds denoted by those single lines. We also can represent this in a ball and stick model, which is shown by that carbon ball and then the 4 hydrogen balls around it, with the sticks connecting those different atoms, making up the ball and stick model. The final way we can kind of represent this molecule is through what's called a space-filling molecule. And that space-filling molecule is basically the balls that represent the atoms being squished together and not having the sticks kind of connecting those different atoms. And so if we look at some of the more complex molecules in terms of a space-filling molecule, you have octane, which is part of gasoline, which is shown here. Then you have a dietary fat, which is a triglycerol, which we'll learn about more whenever we talk about lipids. And so that dietary fat here is a much more complex structure than, say, what we see with methane. All right, whenever we talk about the properties that exist in carbon-based molecules or our organic molecules, those properties really depend on the shape of the molecule and the atoms that are attached to that molecule. And depending on the grouping of the atoms that are attached, they could be single atoms or they could be what we call functional groups. So like a group of atoms that will attach to the carbon on the carbon skeleton. And we'll look at some examples of that as we talk about the main organic molecules, the 4 categories of macromolecules. And a lot of the biological molecules really have more than one functional group. They'll have a couple different functional groups attached to that. And so like with amino acids, there's really 3 groupings: carboxyl group, amine group, and then your what you call a side group or an R group that really determines which amino acid you have. And again, we'll talk about that more when we look at proteins in terms of the macromolecules there. And so with macromolecules, these are really large versions of the organic molecules that we've been talking about. So you can have what's called just molecules or macromolecules, which are usually like a couple carbons long, but then your macromolecules get to be really large and really complex. And if you look at the molecules that are really important for sustaining or being involved in living organisms, there are 4 key categories of macromolecules. The first is carbohydrates, the second are proteins, the third are nucleic acids, and then I'm missing one on this slide here, and we can just write that in for you. Let me get my annotation. So it would be Number 4 would be lipids, or what you could also know as fats. Okay, so that's the 4th category of macromolecules. And again, we're going to provide you with a video going into detail on each of these different types of macromolecules. Okay, whenever we look at macromolecules themselves, they are, like we mentioned, molecules that are made up by putting together a bunch of different smaller molecules. And so we have some terms that we can relate for these different types of molecules. And so the first is that those larger molecules are referred to as polymers. And these large macromolecules are put together by those smaller molecules, which we refer to as monomers. So monomers make up polymers, and then polymers can be broken down into their individual monomers through different cellular processes. And the two big or the two reactions that are important for breaking down and putting together those monomers into polymers and breaking down polymers into monomers are the dehydration reaction and the hydrolysis reaction. The dehydration reaction links two monomers together and removes a molecule of water. And so really what happens is you have these two molecules being put together, and a molecule of water is lost. And that really happens due to a couple of different steps that we'll look at whenever we in the next slide when we look at that figure. Okay, so whenever you put two monomers together, that's happening through what's known as a dehydration reaction. And the dehydration reaction, it links those two monomers together, and during that process it removes a molecule of water, and we'll look at that process individually in the next slide. The opposite of that reaction can happen, and a molecule of water can be inserted into the chemical reaction, and it will cause the bond to break between two carbon molecules, or two carbon atoms, and it will separate the monomers into the polymer into its smaller components, which are the monomers. And so hydrolysis is basically the reverse of a dehydration reaction. And one of the ways I kind of remember this is dehydration reaction loses water, you're dehydrated, and hydrolysis, you're hydrated, you are hydrolyzed, right, or hydrolyzation, and so you gain water in that process. And then you just need to remember that losing water puts molecules together, gaining water breaks those molecules apart. So here is a figure showing both of those reactions. So here we have a short polymer with a monomer on the left-hand side. So here's your short polymer, here's your monomer. And if you notice that on the ends of each of the molecules, whether they're a longer polymer or a monomer, they have a hydrogen on one side and an OH on the other side, so a hydroxyl group. And this is important because these are the atoms that allows for the water to be lost, and then those atoms are replaced whenever the polymers are broken down and the water is put into the system. And so you have the OH on one end and the hydrogen on the other end, so H2, so two H's, O. Those atoms will be lost from the ends of those molecules, and that's where your water comes from. And then the energy to do that is inserted into the chemical bond, and that leads to the formation of that longer polymer chain, those monomers being put together. The opposite happens whenever you undergo hydrolysis. So your water molecules inserted into the system, the bond is broken, energy is released, and one of those hydrogens will attach to one of the molecules, and then the OH group will attach to the other molecule, and you end up with the same molecules that you started with in the left-hand figure. Now we have a little video going over this just to kind of summarize these points. And hopefully if you have any questions, this will clarify those questions for you.
Most biological molecules are very large and are built by assembling small molecules, or monomers, into long chains. The resulting molecules are called macromolecules, or polymers. A process of linking monomers, called dehydration synthesis, involves the removal of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom to form water. One way this might happen is diagrammed here, where several generic monomers are shown with OH groups that could be used for linking. The animation illustrates the joining together of monomers by dehydration synthesis, catalyzed by a polymerase enzyme, and the reverse process, in which added water results in hydrolysis, catalyzed by a hydrolase enzyme.
All right. And so that's it for the overview portion of chapter 3. Now what we're going to do is in the next videos, you're going to learn about each of the different biological molecules in more detail. So we're going to look at carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids in more detail in the following videos. And so we'll see you then.